Welcome back to the Man of Mastery podcast, where we're meeting and learning from men and women, thought leaders in personal optimization and elite level life performance.
7 out of every 10 paychecks that go to somebody who work at an organization go to people who do not actually want to be there.
So welcome back to the Man of Mastery podcast. For those of you who have been here for a little while, you know that this podcast sprung out of my own journey of learning, exploring, and then trying to share some interesting, meaningful, and hopefully helpful things that I've come across. So today we've got a guest, and we're going to talk about the workplace. So some things around meaningful work and producing your best work ever. Mr. Josh Schneider is a speaker, author, consultant, thought leader, and what he calls sleepless dad. Also host of an upcoming podcast called Meaningful Work. And Josh talks a lot about workplace productivity, engagement, and the very important nature of those things, as well as enabling environments for yourself and people to produce the best work possible. What I'm really excited about is I just checked out Josh's new book, 5 Days to Your Best Work Yet. And if you were with us a couple weeks ago, we talked to Chief CJ Kirk, who I know through Krav Maga Houston. One of CJ's biggest things is purpose, finding your purpose, your alignment of your skills and your passion to what you're meant to be doing in life. So with that segue, I'd like to introduce Josh and jump right in. Josh, thanks for joining me today.
Michael, so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, I wanted to cite that segue because when I read your new book, that was one of the things that jumped out at me. So you talk about 5 days to your best work yet. And so take my consulting and MBA hat on for a second here. I sort of saw it as a current state assessment, future state assessment, and then sort of how do I close the gap over the next 6, 12, 24 months. But what I really keyed in on is you talked about in different language and different application, something that we talked about in terms of purpose and passion a couple weeks ago, the exploration of someone's strengths, the way to engage in the workplace and productivity by focusing on strengths, and then really understanding what you call why am I here. And in fact, you got something called the Tingly Feeling compass. So could you talk to us about the importance of workplace engagement and what you mean by purpose, passion, and that compass?
Absolutely. Well, day one when I graduated college, I walked in and was an auditor at a CPA firm. And literally by 9:23 a.m., I thought, this is not where I want to be. And I stayed for a couple of years, and that just sparked me on this journey that our work should be fun, rewarding, fulfilling. And when we show up and win every day, and that's different to each and every one of us, but when we show up and win every day, we create this life that is more full. And I must have been naive enough on the front end to think that this was a possibility. And so now when I look at work and getting to work with organizations of all different sizes, here's what we see. When we look at engagement, what I'm actually looking at, I think you said it in the intro, was that when we can create this energy, this positive energy, all of a sudden it leads us to have more fulfillment. We get to have progress. And that's great, Josh, but how? And so that's why we wrote the book to be 5 days to your best work yet, because everyone is squeezed for time more than ever. Managers are more pressure. Everybody's sitting in traffic longer with more things to think about, with more access to more information than we've ever had before. And dear God, I just want to feel that feeling of satisfaction at work. Gotcha.
So is that the tingly feeling?
So the tingly feeling is, this actually was a time back at the CPA firm, and it was a coworker, Jen and I, and we're sitting out at a client. It's about 8 o'clock at night, and it's her and it's me. And all of a sudden she looks up at me and she goes, Josh, I've got a tingly feeling. And now I was single at the time, so I think, hey, maybe this is good for me. Uh, but then I realized she says, I have a tingly feeling because the numbers matched. And I remember thinking, what? You are excited because as an auditor, that's what you do. You work through all of the systems to hope that the numbers match. But for me in that role, I would get ticked. I mean, you want to talk about being upset or feeling like there's no value in what you do. Like I would spend 2 weeks auditing one thing, and all of a sudden the number would match. And I just felt like I learned nothing new the last 2 weeks, except for that this number is that number. And so at the time I just kind of shrugged it off. But then a few years later, I don't know what about that experience floated to the surface again. And I'm like, you know what? Jen was actually onto something. And Jen did a couple of things. One is she actually knew what her tingly feeling was, meaning she knew what part of her work brought even a physical sense of satisfaction. And what we've now done, so I run the Millennial Employee Engagement Institute, and we structure a lot of our research around this idea of the employee brain, and we've taken the tingly feeling compass. But anyways, here's what actually happened. When Jen had the numbers match, there was a release of dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin in her brain, in her blood. And so she actually had a feeling that was tingly, a good feeling came over her. And this is so natural. And so, you know, we oftentimes think of dopamine as, well, I'm going to go out and have a few drinks after work. And we look forward to that because we know that that experience produces dopamine for us. Or you finish one of your Spartan races. Your body is surging with these beautiful chemicals of satisfaction, of reward. And so how can we bring these into the workplace? And so the tingly feeling is exactly that, is looking at the fact that there is work that we do that is rewarding, that is satisfying. And people all the time, they want to tell me, Josh, you don't understand where I work. You don't understand what I do. Now, a few months ago, I was with a gentleman, and we're looking at one of my consulting clients, and we're looking at his double monitors, and we're standing at his desk, and he goes, Josh, the spreadsheets tell a story. And I look at him, and in his eyes, it's as if Jennifer Aniston like walked into the room and was walking up to him. Like his eyes were just sparkling with delight. And he was having the tingly feeling, telling me about what this data, the story that this data was telling on these spreadsheets. And so many people have this. And so that's the first thing Jen did, was she knew what it was. And the second thing that was so critical that Jen did was she stopped and took a moment to just revel in the joy of the completion of that thing. And I think so many times we rush from one project to the next due to the stress or the pace of work, or the opposite, or just the drudgery of it. And we don't revel in the moment of, I just did this thing that is actually so important and so meaningful to me.
And taking a moment to step back and recognize it and enjoy it. You know, so quick tangent, and you mentioned Spartan race. So yesterday I ran a half marathon. My 11-year-old boy ran with me. It was his first ever half marathon, first ever run of anything close to that distance. And we were at around, you know, we took it slow, wanted to make sure he was good with it. In fact, he had to go play a soccer tournament afterwards. So kid's a champ. So, you know, we took it at a nice pace, and we're probably at about mile 9. And he looked at me. I'm checking in with him. How you doing, buddy? He goes, you know what? I'm doing great, Dad. The thing is, my legs, they were hurting. They were hurting so much that they don't hurt anymore. And I said, okay, you're not injured, right? It's fatigue, it's soreness building up, it's lactic acid. We talked about that before. And, you know, you can do some active rest tomorrow to clear that. But I said, you know, what's going on is some people call it the runner's high. So you've been exercising for a while now, and your body, your brain actually started producing chemicals to help that pain go away while you were doing what you were doing. And some of those things are called endorphins. And he's like, wow, that's really cool. I said, would you believe that what your brain is doing right now naturally to make your body feel good is the same thing people get from drugs? So
Hmm.
why would somebody do drugs if you can go out for a run and get the same feeling of feeling good, mentally feeling good physically? He was like, wow, yeah, like that doesn't make any sense. Let's just run more. So I never thought about it from a work perspective, but yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And so Jen got that tingling feeling by the numbers matching and being an auditor. But the other side of that argument was, well, that wasn't what was meaningful for you, for Josh. So I think one of the things I picked up on from some of your work is, if from a personal perspective, it's certainly about finding satisfying, energizing work. But from a lot of people in my network and maybe in this listener community are either corporate or maybe entrepreneurs or on their path towards something like that. You've got some statistics that have driven your work around the cost of workplace disengagement, or I guess the other side of it is people who don't love their jobs and how costly that is, right?
totally. Let's rewind 1 second. The fact that you and your son had that conversation while in the midst of a half marathon, that
We weren't moving too
yeah.
fast at that point, but hey, why not?
Either way, yeah, and so there's a couple things here. The cost of disengagement. I mean, we've seen from Deloitte that 13% of people love their job and are not looking. If we look more globally at engagement, 7 out of every 10 paychecks that go to somebody who work at an organization go to people who do not actually want to be there. And so when we're looking at 70% levels of disengagement in this country, it's a little bit higher. Rather, the engagement is a little bit higher, but it's alarming. And they Gallup thinks it's roughly $500 billion that it costs us. And you don't have to think about it. You just know one person that you work with who's on their phone all the time or playing a game in a meeting consistently, who's always behind deadlines, and you can begin to see the cost of disengagement. But here's something that's interesting. You're talking about your son's legs hurting. He said, my legs are hurting so much that they don't hurt anymore. And something that we see that ties in, and we call it hypoxia, because all of the research is around this model of the employee brain. And we're constantly looking for what are the true triggers of motivation. And, there's plenty of good stuff out there, but we're truly trying to see what drives an individual human being. We're in such a beautifully diverse world, and there's more cultures than ever working together. And so we can't look at these siloed experiences of motivation. And I love personality assessments, but I think we still, what is at the heart of driving each human being? And when your son said, my legs hurt so much they don't hurt anymore, in the workplace, in the employee brain, we call that hypoxia. And hypoxia is the state that our human brains enter when they're starved of oxygen, meaning they shut down. After about roughly 4 to 5 minutes, like the brain is done, and it will not return to its normal state. And so our employee brains can also enter this state of hypoxia, where they get starved of doing this beautiful of this experience of work that truly matters. And so not only does the human brain enter this, but also you have the employee brain enters this state of hypoxia, which just creates this challenge for an individual. They show up every day, and how do they find their spark? I mean, Michael, nobody wants to go to work and hate their job. It is not human. It's human to desire progress. It's human to feel like you belong to something that matters. And it's interesting. Maybe it's interesting to me, but I don't feel that most people should go be entrepreneurs, because there's beautiful work to be done inside major corporations and small corporations. What we found with the Tingly Feeling is that it's often as little as 4% of our work week. 4% of our time is the one thing that truly drives our innovation, our creativity, and fuels our energy source for all of the other work that is draining or tiring or not nearly as rewarding.
So you've talked about, through the work that you guys do, is let's take the corporate examples. You're trying to create those dynamic cultures that allow for that 4%, for breakthrough ideas, for productivity, and moving companies forward. So am I right? Is that sort of what that magic 4% is like? And how do you create that? And how do you maybe minimize or start to reduce the 96% and get more of that 4% type of time?
For sure. And I think it comes down to an individual level. And that's really because there's so many structures and strategies for how a larger group or how a leadership team can say, hey, in our culture, we're going to begin to work and do this. And there's all of those, I think, more traditional strategies. But if I'm a manager, or heck, if I'm me and I'm in control of me and I have zero budget, what is this thing? And so we have developed the Tingly Feeling compass, and it has, we call them 8 true north elements, because we reached this point where we were like, oh my gosh, Michael, we could help somebody find their tingly feeling. And so we put it up on our website. We can help you find your tingly feeling. And then pretty soon after, we ended up taking that down, because that was sharing the wrong message. The kind of calls we were receiving, it was not that kind of tingly feeling. Right. But there's this ability to back into the level of our work that we enjoy. And I know I said not everybody, I think, should go be an entrepreneur. Let's take me, for example. So if I speak on 3 stages across the country, or I go overseas on any given week, that's actually a very busy week for me as a speaker. Now, I do consulting and some other projects as well, but when I'm on stage in front of a group of, heck, if it's 50 leaders, if it's 2,000 individuals, if it's a whole company, it doesn't matter. That moment for me is like what I call the apex moment. That is the tingly feeling. And so there was the time on the airplane, there's the sales calls, there's the prep work, there's reading research, there's digging, there's marketing, there's tweaking my website, there's having calls with my team, there's this, there's that, there's wondering, am I doing the right thing? Are we talking about this? Who else out there? What is going on? And there's all these other hours. But the moment that I am on stage, everything else becomes worthwhile, because I'm clear on that. And so in those moments of struggle, in those moments of challenge, when, I don't think anybody wakes up on any given day and thinks, oh, this is just the worst. They ended up arriving there by getting slowly off track, and that's where we think with the compass, what's back to 5 days? Who has time? Or, if you find yourself in this challenging situation where you hate your job, where your life seems to be a struggle, you're getting passed over again and again for the promotion. I mean, all the stuff we were talking about before we press record, let's not even begin to talk about what food are we eating, how are we sleeping, what type of relationships are we allowing in our life. Like, let's just say that those things have no impact, although they have such a huge impact.
Right.
What is a tool that somebody could pull out of their pocket? Like, if you and I were dropped off in the middle of the Sahara Desert and we pulled out a compass, we would at least know which way was north. And so the whole premise with the employee brain and the tingly feeling is, how do we help somebody find what true north is?
Yeah, that's super cool. So does it all come down to the individual? I think you kind of said that. So no matter how big or small the corporation is, the right thing to do as a manager, as an executive, as a company leader, is this really a sort of hand-to-hand type of exercise to figure out how to get the most out of every person, how to really engage each individual in the corporation and the culture in their own best way?
I mean, it has to. We look at the massive investments that are flooding the workplace. And I'm not saying that they're not working and that people aren't feeling appreciated, but it has to come down. And the subtitle to the book was A Humanlike Approach to Better Work. And we look at employee engagement, but it's truly humans who are coming to work, and we're more connected than ever. And so how do we bridge this so that way me as a human being who craves flexibility, especially when we see it with the younger generations, I don't know if we crave flexibility more than older generations. It was just asked for, or there was this bit of expectation, and technology kind of opened the door for that. But it has to, if we could get the individuals at every level. So there was a large helicopter producer. So at the time it was Sikorsky Aircraft. Well, it is still Sikorsky, but they've been spun out. And so we were at a location doing a labor audit study. And so there's about 1,200 people that worked in this facility. And I had to go through and interview every single one of them, from the janitor all the way up to it was called the GM of this plant. And seeing the importance to somebody who worked, let's say, third shift, who came into that bird or the helicopter, and that their drivers, that like if that person had a bad day, what we saw is that, and it happens with different shifts, but the engagement level of different people on different shifts somebody on third shift who is disengaged could undo the performance or the good work of somebody from first and second shift. And so that work would not only be slowed, but they could make a poor decision, or they could make a mistake in such a way that it negatively impacted those who were performing. And we saw across all levels of this organization that everybody wants to show up and wants to win. And when you don't feel progress, right, you're running that half marathon. Like you said, we were going kind of slow at that point, but you were still having this feeling of progress. And so how do we get people feeling progress at work more than just, okay, it's a promotion or whatever the normal means? And I understand that when people say that money's not a driver, food on the table is a driver. It is a motivator, but it can't be the only one. If we enter hypoxia, if we slip too far away, man, how do we claw our way back?
Yeah, I definitely think I've met some people over the years that have reached extreme hypoxia and are just work zombies at that point. You've got another statistic that's people who utilize their strengths are 6 times more engaged. I just love the data-driven approach to this. The first time I came across it, I don't know if you're familiar with, so I'm in the San Diego area, there's another author that has a similar topic to yours, probably a very different approach. Ex-Navy guy called Brent Gleason, who used to work with a buddy of mine, and he's got he's written articles for Inc. and some forums like that. His book is called Taking Point Leadership. So he's applied lessons from military leadership to corporate leadership, but he has a very similar message around some statistics and some data about employee engagement, about effective leadership, about engaging it at all levels. And I'm just fascinated by some of his data, some of your data on what a huge impact this is. Or the guy at Sikorsky, where 2/3 of the day can be undone by the last third. It's insane.
It is. And one of the things that I think is most difficult for most of us when we think about strengths is a lot of the general convention wisdom is like, well, focus on what you're good at and hire people to do the rest. And you're like, well, I'm a staff and I can't hire anybody. How do I find my strengths? And here's the thing that, and Marcus Buckingham, who along with Clifton, were kind of brought this strengths movement really to the forefront, is that he's very particular, almost to the point of annoyance, that strengths and weaknesses is not necessarily about just what you're good at and just what you're bad at. So if we're looking at somebody who's focused on their strengths or gets to utilize their strengths, is 6 times more engaged, we're saying that it's not necessarily always what they're good at versus what they're bad at. But what we're looking at is when you are in your strength zone, when you're doing those things that make you feel excited, energized, and focused, you're actually getting energy from that. Whereas a weakness is actually something that weakens you, that de-energizes you. And here's one of, I think, the gaps when we look at just engagement, is that you have incredibly engaged people who value their work, who value who they are, who have personal pride, who exercise curiosity and can't let something slip by them. And they show up to work and there's a problem. And so their boss comes to them and says, hey, Jan, can you solve this problem for us? And Jan goes and solves that problem. And 10 years later, Jan finds herself as executive vice president of solving that problem and wakes up one day and realizes, what am I doing with my life? Because this problem that Jan was solving was actually a weakness. But because Jan was committed, Jan is a hard worker, Jan is engaged. When we look at all of the traditional senses of engaged, she found a way to get the job done. She put herself, she probably started to realize, if I eat a certain way, I can get more energy. If I sleep a certain way, I can get more energy. If I focus on these things, I can get more energy, and found a way to win. But all of a sudden wakes up one day and is just depleted at 0. And that comes down to just a simple looking at all of their work was centered in this thing that drained them. And so one of the things that I'm constantly telling people is you got to get clear on even what those strengths are, and taking a $15 StrengthsFinder assessment, or there's free ones out there, can begin to give you clarity. And, you know, even for example, one of mine from StrengthsFinder is learner. I think it's one of the more popular ones. I just love to learn. And so there's days when I will wake up. Michael, you know, I'm an entrepreneur now in close to 10 years. For five of those years, I was working as a server at a restaurant, trying to keep food on the table for my family while I'm trying to grow this business. And I was so excited, so engaged in that process. And so it's like, I love what I do, but there were days where I found myself waking up being like, what am I doing all of this for? And back then, when I didn't have food on the table, it was very clear to me, well, you're not yet in the midst of the thing that you are desiring. And now I'm in the midst of the thing that I'm desiring. And there are days that I wake up and there's these evil thoughts that want to penetrate, and they say, like, why are you doing what you're doing? And in those moments, over time, I've learned, okay, when is the last time I just blocked out 3 hours on my calendar and sat down and dove into some good old research? Now, because I'm listening to podcasts, or I'll be listening to some books when I'm on the go, or I'm constantly thinking of ideas, or calling people and saying, hey, what do you think about this? But I've learned that if I get too far out of alignment with some of these core strengths, that engagement, which creates energy, excitement, all of a sudden starts to dip. And so if somebody who can find a way to craft their job, or find the tingly feeling, that 4% of their work, and we're looking at 6 times more engaged. When you're engaged in an organization, you're going to win. When you win at work, you come home and you bring energy with you. And then all of a sudden, your spouse, I mean, imagine this world where everybody comes home and their kids are seeing parents who are excited and optimistic and encouraged about their work. What kind of, you want to talk about how does a country or how does a community go to the next level as they pass the baton on to the next generation? It's by the younger generation seeing that work can be meaningful, that work can be fulfilling. Not that work needs to be 80 hours to be fulfilling, but that in the confines of a regular working schedule, you can derive meaning without it overriding the rest of your life.
Cool. So that energy. So for you, you've figured out where your strength is, your why, your mission, and one of those things for you is learning, and by identifying that, you know to come back to that to sort of re-energize when you need to. I'm glad you went there in terms of where that energy carries over into beyond yourself. And as you mentioned, family and children and that extension of your life. Let's go there in a second. But in terms of expansion of that energy into a group, one thing I did want to ask before we leave a little bit more of the business setting is another book I came across recently. It's called The Culture Code, Daniel Coyle, if I'm pronouncing his name right. Are you familiar with that one? They have a really data-driven approach to the interaction of groups and getting successful and productive group engagement. Do you, in the work you guys do, does it extend beyond each of the individuals and up to that group level somehow?
Totally. And I think that the power of teams and groups is going to continue to really drive organizations as we kind of micro down a little bit. And here's the thing. If you walk into a group or a room and those people don't like you, how do you feel about it?
Right. I mean, you could feel it right away, right?
Totally. And so when you walk into a room, and one of the other premises that I believe in, not only the tingly feeling, but this idea of Meraki, which is the soul. So Meraki is a Greek term that didn't get translated into our language because it actually means the soul, the love, the essence of you that you put into your work. And when you show up and somebody is living with Meraki, meaning they are going all out. So, for example, you and your wife go out to dinner, a really nice, special place. This is a celebration dinner. You sit down. There's a couple cocktails on the table. Bottle of wine is open, and a server walks up to you and goes, "Thank you for coming. My name is Josh. I have a couple of specials to tell you about," and pulls out their notepad and reads the specials to you, very well articulated, and hands you the menus and says, "Anything else that you need? Once again, my name is Josh. I'll be here." And they walk away, and you probably don't think anything of it because it was a relatively standard transaction. Nothing went wrong. They remembered their name. They were able to there's some servers that when they approach the table, you just get nervous as they approach. But then there's this server with Meraki. If we rewind back the tapes, you got the cocktails, bottle of wine, you're out on the patio. It's perfect. It's just perfect. And the server approaches and they're like, "Welcome to Cafe Cortina. My name is Josh. I'll be taking care of you. I was just with the chef and he shared with me a couple of specials that he wants me to tell you. And first we got some halibut fresh this afternoon, and he's doing fillets of halibut with a little bit of pesto onto the grill. And the sear marks of the grill are really going to lock in the flavor. And what he's done with that is he's fresh squeezed some oranges, created a little bit of a citrus vinaigrette, and he's going to play over the saltiness of the halibut with the sweetness of this citrus, a really nice play to kind of open up your palate. And additionally, tonight I have a bone-in ribeye. Now, it is aged down in the Eastern market, and we have a locker down there that is lined in Himalayan salt. I mean, if you and I were to stand in there for 2 minutes and lick our lips, it would remind us of the warm Mediterranean Sea. And it ages in there for 40 days and for 40 nights. And at this point, you're like, "I'm vegan, but I think I'll take both of those." and it's just this subtle difference of, instead of this standard average transaction, can we find this way to release these little sparks, these little twists of Meraki? And when we do that, to get all the way back to your question about groups and teams, that's the woman that I want to work next to. Somebody who shows up with that zest, that excitement, that love, that passion for what they do, because that's also infectious. If somebody who doesn't have that Meraki comes into a team that is bursting with Meraki, guess what? That person is like, "This is not for me."
Yeah. So that to me, when you were telling that, well, one, the taste buds are firing, and now I'm hungry. But two, it was to me all about emotion and passion and feeling And that description, triggering something that wasn't just mechanical and transactional. It was definitely a different dynamic, a different energy. Just like you mentioned, walking into a room where you can feel the adversarial energy. This was a type of energy that creates a totally different dynamic, and finding ways to apply that dynamic synergistically in a group to a team. You would get amazing results.
Yes.
You did talk also about the team at home, the spouse and the children, and you mentioned earlier that we chatted a bit here, sort of pre-record, about not just finding your strengths and your passions in maybe the mechanics of what you do career-wise, but that there's a fueling, literally a fueling factor to your health that also bears on that. So you mentioned international travel. You travel tremendously. You're busy out with clients and speaking engagements. So what kind of things do you do that we can learn from to bring that energy from a personal health, fuel, exercise, movement perspective that also, you said set it aside, but let's bring it back in. How does that also translate to work and engagement?
Yeah, we talked about, I'll say to people, you don't have to have that after lunch crash. And people just look at me like, what are you saying? And it's not an extra coffee, and it's not a 3 p.m. cookie that's going to carry you through that. Over the years, as I wanted to prepare my body and mind for this, I just became very fascinated. My wife 7 years ago became very sick, so much so that if she had just a scratch of gluten, she'd be in bed for 3 days, not be able to get out. And so it was almost a blessing, because it caused us to start to look at some of these things, or some of these ways to live, or realizing that what I eat drives my energy. And I'm fascinated personally with the idea of living to 120, which you balance that with, having read The 4-Hour Work Week by Tim Ferriss, and my mindset on life is probably very different than most. But I think it's a shame to try and make it to retirement to hope that you've been able to hold your breath long enough and exhale. And so I kind of looked at that moment. I said, what if instead of retiring at, let's say, 65, what if I retire at 95? And what if all the things that I desire and want to achieve, instead of achieving them by, let's say, 50, what if I'm comfortable with that time and I'm getting pushed out to 70? And so then I started to examine how I have to treat my body. And it opens up this whole fascinating world of, why do you do what you do, and how do you love what you do? And in reality, I think, if it truly comes down to it, every individual, if they could believe that they could get more energy, because I got sick and tired of getting home at the end of the day or from a long trip and then not being able to spend time with my kids, or then my wife, who was second fiddle to me being gone all week, is still second fiddle to me recuperating. And so there's absolutely times for that, but life cannot be just working for work to get ready for work. And, I believe that I'm on a mission to make the world a better place. And so I unfortunately slip into that so quickly. And I push aside certain eating habits so quickly. But I truly think that if everybody were to begin to examine, what you're eating, how does it truly make you feel? And I don't think, if everybody were to, I don't know, maybe try keto, but if you were to maybe try a plan like Whole30 or eat paleo for just 30 days and see how you could feel, and realize that energy can truly, from the moment that I wake up to the moment that I go to bed, my goal is to have consistent, steady energy. And Michael, I didn't tell you, but I have been off coffee now for a week and a half, simply out of testing to see what this could do for me. The first few days were not pretty.
Right, no doubt. But now,
so well, I'm still testing.
All right, fair enough.
But it's a long answer, but I truly think that if everybody were to just test and experiment and think about what it is that you're taking in and how is it that you feel afterwards, I mean, that's the simple litmus test right there.
Yeah, I completely agree. So a bit of a plug or a spoiler alert. I mentioned to you we've got a guest coming on here in the near future who has made a crazy transformation in his own life and health and fitness and weight through some changes around exactly that whole 30. I think he mentioned paleo. He definitely is on the ketogenic bandwagon. But to me, one of the underlying themes to any of those is, and I'll go all the way back to your statement about the after work, after lunch, the food coma, and for a long time I just took that idiom to be a truism, whereas it's the furthest thing from the truth. There's no reason to have that lull, that energy dip, a lot of which goes along with, at least for my own feeling for my body, is it goes along with that blood sugar dip. But
Yes.
the common to me theme between those three eating styles that we just mentioned are it's a movement towards more natural eating. Wind back the clock maybe a couple hundred years, or at least 100 years before industrial farming, before the advent of so much processed food. A book I've just ordered and I'm really looking forward to getting into is called Feeding Your Lies, How to Unravel the Food Industry's Playbook and Reclaim Your Health. So this is by a lady that calls herself, what does she call herself? It's like the food mama or something like that. But basically, out of the interest of her own health and of her family, she started asking questions like, well, hey, is this cereal we eat every morning? Like, what's in it? Is this okay? And other processed foods. And she's actually gone out and through different means, whether petition or social media, other sort of groups of interest or even Freedom of Information Act requests. She has dug into some of these food companies, including like Starbucks, some of the big beverage companies, to find out like what's actually in this stuff that we're consuming, and what by way of that, am I okay with that, or is it okay for me? Is it even good for me? So yeah, I'm totally on that bandwagon of, if we really look at what we're consuming, how it's making us feel, there's just a whole world of possibility there.
And coffee is actually, I think, a very interesting one. So at home, we use the bulletproof bean because it focuses on low toxins, low mold. But you look at companies like Maxwell House and Folger, and not even going against the flavor profile, which that's another thing. But you're talking about what I like, the swaggiest of beans, and the toxin and mold intake that we bring in through our coffee is horrible.
Yeah. So you might want to check out her book. One of the things she gets into is she does have some stuff around coffee. The Starbucks one was not actually around the mold and toxins issue with the beans so much as there was. I'm not much of a Starbucks guy, and I don't really put anything in my coffee other than actually bulletproof MCT oil. But
Nice.
they've got a really popular, or have had, I think it's like a pumpkin spice latte. And she uncovered something, I think it was the caramel flavor. I'm sure it's not real caramel, which in itself is just sugar, but something about this flavoring that Starbucks was so widely and using so popularly, I think it's classified in California as a carcinogen. Right, it's just crazy. And another thing she gets into is some of the processed food differences and standards between the U.S. and Europe. So you mentioned your wife and gluten. I've had people mention to me, gosh, I go back to Europe to visit family, and I know people walk in Europe more so, but I mean, we're enjoying breads and and croissants and baguettes and pastas,
Mm-hmm.
and the feeling, of my energy and even just, my gut and bloat and things like that, I feel good. And then I come back here, and if I try to eat the same thing, it's just a totally different effect. And she uncovers some of those differences in what's okay. If you're gonna do some processed foods, what's actually in them?
Yeah, I think the European Union as a whole is still very much like GMO free, and most of our grains are GMO and genetically modified. And so it's crazy because you hear stuff like that, and you're like, well, if it's not mainstream, then it must be wrong. But that's where it comes back to just thinking about how it is that you feel, and give yourself a 30-day litmus test on something to see how you truly can feel. And then you realize, oh my gosh, when I eat that thing, it's game over.
Right, right. And back to the travel thing, I think that can be even harder. Or in some ways, I've found myself more disciplined when I'm out on the road, if I know what kind of things are working for me, like you're saying, and I just make it a point to steer myself towards those. And I'll carry some food along in case I really get in a pinch and I need a snack on a plane or something like that. But otherwise, I'll just go seek out a menu somewhere that has something that's going to work for me. And I say sometimes I'm better at while I'm traveling, because sometimes if I'm at home, if we haven't gotten the grocery shopping done or something like that, is when you sort of revert to the freezer or something that where you go off the rails. So that's how I've kind of done it on the road.
And I think, at least for me, when I'm on the road, I oftentimes have to be very on, and so it is almost easier to just push aside the need for full satiation, or I keep like some Epic bars, which are meat based, and macadamia nuts I've found to be really useful because they're loaded with calories. And so even a handful of macadamia nuts, you're going to get probably 200-300 calories, a ton of healthy fats, and your body actually has enough energy to sustain. Even though my body might still scream I'm hungry, my mind can say, like, no, energy wise, you're good, Josh.
Right. Yeah, I've got some other stuff I'll just carry with me when I travel as well. I'll shoot it over to you afterwards if you haven't tried it to give it a try. We think, how do we wrap up here? I mean, we've strayed pretty far from what you actually do on a day-to-day basis, but this is, I mean, it's all part of the same package, right? Is showing up, giving your best, doing things you're passionate about, bringing energy to those endeavors. And you've got not only the most recent book, the 5 Days to Your Best Work Yet, but you've got several others: Engagement Guide for Managers and Leaders, Generation Next Level, and Define Purpose, Create Your Future. So I'm really looking forward to getting into those as well. It's been really inspiring to talk to you. Where is the best place, and what's the best way, if people are interested in learning more, to engage with you?
Yeah, probably just the website, joshschneider.com. And we've got some really exciting formalized research coming out later this year. And, truly, I think, like, if you're saying, like, how do we wrap this up? To me, it's about alignment. I don't golf much, because it can be frustrating, but, somebody steps up and drives the ball, and I think like 50% of drives end up in the woods, or some silly statistic like that. I probably made that one up. But the difference between a drive going straight and a drive going with a nasty slice, left or right, comes down to just about 1 or 2 millimeters. When the club hits the ball, it's simply just 1 or 2 millimeters off. And I think so many people think that they're broken, or that they could never achieve a version of elite performance, or they could never truly unleash their best work yet, or this whole mess that they think they're living in could never get fixed. And I cannot believe that everybody is broken. And I think that just a couple of tweaks, figuring out what your tingly feeling is, getting a little bit more connected to your passion, truly stepping in and just sometimes taking a degree of action. You know, I believe that inaction breeds anxiety. And so that's where the 5 days, to me, working with somebody like yourself who's like, okay, let's take action and find something. And I believe that as those start to happen, it's like an ice cube tray. One area spills into the next, spills into the next, spills into the next, and all of a sudden we get this momentum going. And for me, my passion is work. People should not have to hate their job. There is enough beautiful work out there that needs to be done that matches up with something that's meaningful for somebody at least 4% of their work week. And so, Michael, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a pleasure to kind of share some of these ideas and add some value to some people.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine. I'm going to call you out on that statistic because far more than 50% of my drives land in the wood. It's probably about 80%, speaking from personal performance. But yeah, thank you so much for the information and the time and the perspective on that. I mean, I completely agree on the point of action and applying passion. I've got this tagline of elite level life performance for what I'm shooting for, what I'm aiming to do. And I've said before, it's not some sort of lofty state. I truly believe it's sort of, those 1 or 2 millimeters beyond where you are now. And some of that is simply taking action, which is the difference between what unfortunately the masses are doing in inaction. Taking action, you're going to have your setbacks, you're going to have your progress, you're going to have your plateaus, but it's that small, consistent forward motion that adds up to some incredible results over time. And I love how you're applying it to the workplace, to engagement, and you put a dollar figure on it. Ultimately, this is not only about personal satisfaction and realization through work, but I mean, these are real financial things for businesses. So thank you so much for what you're doing and the perception. Sorry, the perspective. And I will put a link here in the show notes to joshschneider.com. I'd really like to see people get in touch with you, hit your site, learn more about what you're doing. And again, the books are fantastic.
Michael, thank you again so much.
Okay, show notes for this one are at the website, manofmastery.com/012-012. Go check out Josh's website as well. I've got links to his site, to his book. He's got some really great information, ideas, and actionable steps around workplace employee engagement and productivity. Okay, that's a wrap for this week. As always, thank you so much for your time. I do really, really appreciate it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go over to iTunes, hit subscribe, give us some feedback in the form of a rating for the podcast, and we'll see you next week.